Welcome back. It's the Big Blue Banter, New York Giants football podcast. I'm Dan Schneier, joined as always my co-host Nick Filato. Today, the crux of this show will be our definitive case for the pros and cons against and for re-signing Saquon Barkley this offseason. If you're the New York football Giants, if you're Joe Schoen, we're going to go over the full case, every pro, every con. We'll wrap up the show by giving our final thought on what we would do if we were in Joe Schoen's shoes. We don't want to have this be an open-ended discussion where at the end we're like, it's wishy-washy. You don't know where Nick or Dan stands on this. We'll decide where we stand on this, and we'll live with that. And our stance on where we want them to go doesn't mean they have to go that direction. It doesn't mean if they don't go in that direction, we're going to throw a hissy fit and freak out. These guys know more than us. They're the ones who are paid to do this, A. B, any decision made on Barkley or Jones or whatever isn't going to kill the Giants one way or another in the long term, in my opinion, at least, especially on like the Barkley front, because I do think regardless of what happens, if they do re-sign him, he will have some trade value at all points of that contract. So if worse comes to worse, and the Giants are not progressing how they want to, they can move him for some picks. But before we do any of that, we are going to also touch on what happened today and yesterday with the news of one, the Colts making the decision to hire Steichen as their new head coach, which means Wink Martindale will return as the Giants defensive coordinator. And then two, the Cardinals making the decision to hire Gannon as their new head coach, which means Mike Kafka is out of the mix and he will return as the Giants offensive coordinator. But before we do any of that, I got an email, Nick, that I wanted to address. And for those of you who might be listening and saying, well, you guys haven't done a mailbag in a little while. One, you're right, and we're going to do that soon. But two, you might also be thinking, I've sent some questions in. How come I'm not getting my question read here? Well, to be quite frank with you and blunt, my uncle is the one who sent this email in. And my uncle is an avid listener of the Big Blue Banter podcast. And he doesn't miss an episode. And you know what? Family comes first. And so he is going to get some special treatment here. And we're going to read his email and address it. I did want to get your take on it, Nick, because I thought it was very interesting. So straight from Uncle Steve. He says, as an old offensive lineman, and my uncle did used to play the center position. So him and I are big time center guys. We believe, the Giants should address this position sooner than later. But he says, as an old offensive lineman, I was really impressed with how Kansas City used pre and post and immediately post snap motion to clear out the second level of the defense behind the offensive line on run plays. But it was also very unusual to see that kind of play strategy in the run game. He says, I can't give you the exact plays. Not all of us have the things on tape, but I would be interesting to have you guys take a look at or discuss this as that usually that conversation is restricted to just the passing game. One of the reasons I am impressed by Andy Reid was his ability to use that motion in the run game. So what were your thoughts on that? Because I know you also posted a tweet about, this is why this came to mind, Nick, of the play they ran from your high school where they're using motion pre-snap. And then the Giants have done this as well at times with Breida and Barkley to actually create stuff in the run game, both pre and post-snap motion.
I was going to say, that's not just something the Kansas City Chiefs have done. The New York Giants did it this year. I mean, a lot of teams have used types of jet motion. I mean, I think of the Rams have done it recently to clear out linebackers and to force them to commit or force them to push, and then you hand the football off in the A gap or the B gap to set up better running lanes for the running back and also better lanes for the offensive lineman to climb to get a better angle at that linebacker who didn't even say bail outside, but just cheated to the outside. And now he removed himself from his responsibility just a little bit to allow that center to have a clean angle. Yeah, the Chiefs do an excellent job at that, but that's not just something that the Chiefs do. A lot of teams around the NFL utilize that type of strategy because it's a smart way to run the football.
Yeah, and it's also something you mentioned when you broke down the play on the first podcast was, well, you also have to rely on these receivers to make big blocks in these situations. And I like how these teams like the Chiefs and the Giants have done this as well, have gotten creative with using the receivers to come around in motion and then operate as a blocker. And in some ways we saw, like, I remember there was a red zone play with the Giants. Well, I'm turning off my phone. Sorry about that for anyone listening and heard that noise. But there's a red zone play with the Giants where they actually used the motion and had like Brightwell, I believe, or one of the backs, Breida maybe, coming around as a lead blocker for Barkley. And then he was running the touchdown. So I think it's cool also, and the Giants have done this, using those ancillary players as like lead blockers or in the blocking scheme on those motion plays.
It's maximizing all the personnel out there. You want to get
Mhm.
all 11 guys out there and you want to use them. You don't just want them out there. Oh, I'm a wide receiver. I catch the football. No, you have to block. Isaiah Hodgins was a good blocker. Darius Slayton is an above average blocker. Sterling Shepard this season. How many times did we see wide receiver
Right.
insert, which is like a Y insert into the B gap to pick up like a Sam linebacker or something like that? And then all he has to do is just get in his way enough to allow Saquon Barkley to hit the hole and accelerate up to the third level. So all of those little things, they kind of are connected, right? And I feel like the Giants, Mike Kafka, maybe it's Brian Dable, they have used motion, I would say, well, and I expect to continue to see that now that Mike Kafka is coming back to open up rushing lanes. And also, it looks similar to when they do pass the football. You don't want to be predictable, right? If you're only running motion to pass the football, you're going to become predictable, and teams are going to pick up on those tendencies.
Yep, completely agree with that. So let's talk a little bit about the Giants now retaining both of their coordinators for this coming season. Excuse me, I tweeted out how it was kind of like a double win for the Giants because the Eagles lost their two coordinators and the Giants retained their two. I'm very excited about this. I mean, look, Nick, for me, just thinking about back at the 2022 season where the Giants won 9 games, won a playoff game, were expected to win 4 or 5. If you had to ask me what the biggest factor in their rise was, to me, it's coaching, and it's a big drop off between the next factor. I love the progression Daniel Jones had, but if I'm being honest, I think a lot of that had to do with the coaching. I love the progression the Giants had as a red zone offense, but if I'm being honest, I think a lot of that had to do with the coaching. And I love some of the progression the Giants made on the defensive side of the ball as far as holding teams to field goals in the red zone. Third down defense was great. But again, a lot of that I think has to do with the coaching. So to me, to get these two guys back, in addition to obviously having the continuity for Daniel Jones having a coordinator, and obviously on the other side of the ball, Wink Martindale fitting right back in, same defensive system. Players you drafted to fit that system now get to play in that system. Communication is good. All of those factors are really important for retaining any coordinator. But these two specifically, Nick, I think give the Giants an edge on a weekly basis. In Wink's case, I know people point to the DVOA being really bad this year, which it was for the Giants defense, and to the schedule being really easy. The Giants played no good quarterbacks basically all year, with the exception of Hurts and Lawrence and a few others, but not really many. But my counter to that, and I'm curious to get your take on that, Nick, is yeah, of course the DVOA is bad. The dude was playing with CFL level linebackers. And yeah, we all love Nick McLeod and Fabian Moreau because on tape they look okay, but Wink makes them look okay. Like these aren't players that were signed by other teams, or these aren't players that were made in the plan, were made a big part of the plan for other teams. These are guys that they're just cycling in at corner week to week to week, including safety where they had to move in Jason Pinnock or Belton. They didn't really have many options there. So you're talking about like the third and second level of your defense having not much talent all year. Of course, the defense wasn't going to finish strong in DVOA. That's my take on Wink. I think if he comes back and gets better personnel, he can be a much more effective coach in those metrics.
And not even just Wink Martindale. If you look at all of these other coaches, look at what Andre Patterson has done for Dexter Lawrence, right? And Jerome Henderson, you could go back to his time with Joe Judge's coaching staff, what
Yep.
he did for all of those defensive backs who seem to have career years. James Bradbury, Adoree Jackson this season, even back in 2021. Jabril Peppers had a really good year his first year in New York as well. I love those positional coaches. Now they can stay in their role, right? Jerome Henderson doesn't have to be considered to be a defensive coordinator. And I also feel like you already basically said all the good points, right? Like Wink Martindale getting another draft, bringing his players to fit his system, upgrading the personnel, 2 drafts now with this coaching staff, with this general manager. That should only bode well for Wink Martindale. And I think you brought up a good point about how much we like Fabian Moreau, how much we like Nick McLeod, but those guys shouldn't be relied on to start and play 70 snaps a game, right? You get a true number 2 cornerback to play with Adoree Jackson, who can hopefully be healthy with the safeties in place, and that secondary is going to be foundationally better. Also, the linebackers. That's the huge point right there. When you can't fit the run correctly, it's going to rely that safety to fly down into the box, a Julian Love type, so much more to protect the run, which opens up play action, passing attack. So there were just so many holes on this defense this year. So the DVOA might have sucked, Dan. Give it another year, more personnel, and I think Wink Martindale will really find a way to maximize these guys. Plus, those edge rushers were young. Azeez Ojulari was not healthy the entire year. Let these blitz packages marinate a little bit with these personnel, and I think we're going to be happy at the end of the day.
I completely agree. And just to touch a little bit on another thing you mentioned there, I thought you made a great point about how the positional coaches can now stay in their roles because everyone's kind of assumed like, and I saw a lot of discussion points on this. when the talking point was, if the Giants lose Wink Martindale, if the Giants lose Mike Kafka, well, everyone's like, well, you got this guy who can step into this role. And Jerome Henderson, we don't know for sure these guys can call plays, right? This is a tough thing to do live. You have to just call plays. You have to have a play sheet and figure out the best play for each situation. That in real time, you have 30 seconds to do it. Like, you just don't know. You didn't know with Kafka. They took a blind leap of faith, and they were right on that one. But you don't know if Shea Tierney can just all of a sudden be a great play caller, right? These guys sometimes are awful play callers that were great in other ways. Byron Leftwich, for example, was so good that they thought he might be a head coach. Then he had a chance to call plays, and he was terrible at it, and he ran a terrible offense. This happens all the time where these guys are great positional coaches or bright minds or whatever it may be. But in the moment when the bullets are flying, they can't call the plays well, and they do a poor job of calling the plays. We already know in the moment when the bullets are flying, these two guys do a really good job of calling plays. The Giants defense had no talent, and yet they were really good in the red zone, really good on third downs. The offense, my God, Mike Kafka turned this red zone offense into one of the best in the NFL. It was dead in the water as the worst in the NFL, and they barely upgraded personnel. Mike Kafka schemed up free touchdown squares at early points in the season. The Bellinger play against Carolina, the Myrick touchdown, the 2 touchdowns against the Bears on the roll. It's like free touchdown squares that we never got. We never had those. And there were like really good timely play calls by Kafka too that I remember, like the bootlegs with Jones, or like in some of these games down the stretch, like runs of games when he would run 2 plays in a row and catch them by off guard, like when they had like the full house backfield and they gave it up the A gap to Brightwell, just like things that got the Giants free yards in key spots, situational play calls. I think he did a great job of, Mike Kafka. So I think when you think of these coaches, a lot of the reason Giants had so much success to me last year was the coaching, and now they have that coaching back. If they had just lost that coaching, we could have taken that blind leap of faith and said, oh, well, Shea Tierney will do a good job. Oh, Henderson's ready, but you don't know that, and it could have been really bad. So this to me was as big of a re-signing on both ends, a bigger retain as you can get besides Daniel Jones for me this offseason.
And we've said it so much throughout the season, the importance of the coaching staff, the continuity, all of those cliches, but they go beyond cliches because we've seen a true turnaround under Brian Daboll. We've seen Brian Daboll delegate to offensive coordinator Mike Kafka, who first-time play calling did an excellent job. Wink Martindale finally leaves Baltimore, did a good job. But you have to consider all of those circumstances that we talked about over the last 5 minutes. So I'm just very pleased at the fact that both of these guys are back in-house.
And the last final thing when it comes to the Wink situation there at defensive coordinator, Nick, I just think from a fun standpoint, right? As fans, as analysts, and not just from a fun standpoint, from just the ability of 1, fun, 2, fun in watching, 2, having fun watching football, I should say, and 2, being kind of
different.
Different. Yeah, contrarian is what I was thinking, but different. And both are the same. That gives you an edge. When you're contrarian, it's just like in poker or all these other games that I play. It's like, if you take a different approach than every single other person, fantasy football is a good example of that. When kind of Zero RB came out with Sean Siegel, shout out Sean Siegel, old friend of mine, the creator of Zero RB. When he first dropped that in the high stakes fantasy league and he won that first year, no one else was doing that. Everyone was pounding running backs for 3 straight rounds, and he didn't take a single one. When you go contrarian, you have a chance to be better because offensive coordinators are not focusing on what Wink Martindale does every week, right? When as more of these defenses go with the Fangio approach of like the 2 high look, having split safeties, playing a lot of zone, and then they face a defense like Wink, who's playing a lot of man with a single high safety. It's harder to figure out a game plan because you were so used to game planning around different style of defense. So for 1, that's good. And 2, it's fun when you dictate on the defense side of the ball. I have a lot more fun watching this Giants defense when they're attacking versus the old school Perry Fuel and the Patrick Graham style of dropping back. And I think you guys do too. So we get that too, right? We're also getting that back too, the fun of it and the contrarian difference of it.
It just blitz. I mean, It's no wonder that Wink Martindale has led the league in blitzing several different times, and he led the league by a pretty wide margin. It was almost 50%. It was just under 50%. You're talking about over 40% blitz rate from the New York Giants, man. That is dictating right there. Now, can you imagine if they have the personnel on the back end who can actually hold up a man coverage for longer than 2.5 seconds?
Right. 1, if you get him the personnel at corner, so he feels more comfortable blitzing more. 2, if you get him, he doesn't need much. He just wants a little bit to be able to stop that run. He's not going to allocate much resources on a per play basis to stopping the run anyway, but just give him what he needs there to stop the run, and then he can feel more comfortable doing other things as well. So I just think the ceiling with Wink as your DC is really high. We've already seen it in Baltimore. The year where they had those three corners healthy, Wink ran one of the best, most dominant defenses in the NFL that year. So we just need to get him talent, and he'll be a really good coordinator for the Giants, I believe. And also the players obviously love playing for him.
Yeah. And think about those times in Baltimore, too. All of those defenses were stout against the run, right?
Yeah.
He doesn't neglect the run. It's just the Giants did not have the personnel in place
Right.
this year. And that's not just at linebacker. That's also on the defensive line. Yeah, you had Leonard Williams. He was hurt. Dexter Lawrence, absolute stud. Outside of those two, though, Dan, you didn't have anybody to cycle in there who was competent enough to play 10 snaps a game, like the Justin Ellises of the world. Like those guys shouldn't be out there playing NFL snaps. Now, if you replace that with a rookie, somebody who might be a little bit raw, but he can anchor down and he can shed and he has powerful hands, and you might add a little bit more from the pass rushing standpoint, then we're talking about a just totally different front relative to what we saw in 2022.
Yeah, that's another great point. So there's just so much to like about these two guys coming back, I think, for the Giants. I'm really excited about having them both back in the mix. We'll see what happens. Obviously, down the line, you can start to worry about that, but don't worry about that now. It's a little too early. But yeah, let's move forward now and discuss Saquon Barkley. The main topic today, the Giants' decision that's looming right now. They're in contract negotiations with Saquon Barkley. Do you re-sign Saquon Barkley? Do you let him hit the market? Do you franchise tag him? Do you franchise tag and trade him? Those are probably the four options on the table right now for the New York Football Giants. So we're going to discuss them all today. Let's start by talking a little bit of value, contract value. According to Spot Track, his market value is 4 years, $50 million or $49.26 million with $12.35 million average salary. We've heard the Giants are right around that range in contract negotiations. They want to pay him about $12.5 million AAV, average annual salary. Saquon wants closer to 16. I think if these sides do get a deal done, it will be closer to the 14 million range, somewhere in the middle, 13 and a half, 14 million. Guarantees will play a big factor in that. So from starters, Nick, where do you feel? And Saquon Barkley just turned, 26 on February 9th? I think it says, yeah, I think he turned 26 a few days ago. Shout out, happy birthday, Saquon Barkley. So 26-year-old running back hitting the market. Where are you at firstly, I guess, on the contract value, where we've heard the Giants are reportedly at, and then where he wants to be at? Where do you think makes, I don't want to say makes sense, but where do you think they'll kind of, if they do sign him, where do you think that will end up, I should say?
Well, it seems like Saquon Barkley wants a little bit more than that 12 and a half. And I can understand why. Look, he's coming off of a career year. He said he doesn't want to reset the market. He wants to be realistic, was the word that he used. But when you look at Ezekiel Elliott in your division, who's making 15, probably wants something closer to that number. That 12 and a half number is something that I'm willing to entertain. 15 starts getting a little tricky around that point for me. I mean, we'll go through the pros and the cons. 12 and a half puts him around the Joe Mixon territory, the Dalvin Cook territory. Alvin Kamara makes 15 as well. Christian McCaffrey is at the top of the market at just north of 16 million per year. So I kind of like Spotrack's number of 12 and a half right there, right? He's just coming off of a contract where he was getting paid 7.7 mil annual. So that's not quite doubling it, but it's a substantial number more than what he was making before. So I understand where he's coming from, but man, allocating a huge contract to a running back with a long injury history who just turned 26 years old, it can be a dangerous game. And we'll kind of get into that throughout this podcast.
Yeah, and I think worth mentioning when you talk about the comparable contracts, Joe Mixon is the most comparable of all the deals. I think Nick Chubb's was pretty comparable as well. When you look at all of those players, they were all younger when they signed that contract with their team. So Mixon was 24 when he signed it, Kamara 25, Cook 25, and Christian McCaffrey was 23 when he signed that deal. Obviously, it's not, you can hear that stat and be like, oh, you're just talking about 1 or 2 or 3 years younger. But in running back years, it's almost like dog years. Like, you know what I mean? Like these years, every year matters. We have the data now and the stats. And we'll get into this when we talk about the cons. We have the stats that show average, I think it's 26.8 now, where these guys just fall off cliffs at the position. And there's just very few guys at 27, 28, 29 these days since the 2010s. Now, I've also seen data that shows like back in the 2000s, these guys were playing for forever. And there were a lot of cases of guys doing well. But nowadays, from about 2010 on, when you get to that 27-year-old mark, you're really hitting a cliff. And now you're relying on these guys being out. If you're re-signing them, you're relying on them being outliers in that standpoint, from that standpoint. So I just thought it was worth mentioning that all of those players were younger when they signed the contract. Barkley's obviously 26. But without further ado, let's break down all of the pros first, and then we can get into some of the cons here. So I want to with the first pro for me and get your thoughts on that. The first pro for me is Barkley was the best player on the Giants offense this year, for the most part, I would say. Now, there's probably a debate between Barkley and Jones as far as who was the best player. Sorry, Andrew Thomas was the best player on the Giants offense. Yeah. That was a mistake by there. The second best player in the Giants offense was Saquon Barkley. And what I meant by best anyway in the first place was from just a stats and production standpoint, I should say the most productive player on the Giants offense, because a quarterback is obviously expected to have some kind of production. He touches the ball a lot more than the running back. But for the first, I don't know, 3/4 of the season, this offense ran through Saquon Barkley. It was Saquon Barkley, design bootlegs for Daniel Jones, get the ball out fast and easy and quick around the line of scrimmage, or run with it when you drop back if you're Daniel and you're the quarterback. So this offense did revolve around this player. And in addition to that, Nick, I thought his film was the best of his career this year. I thought he had a career year from a game film standpoint in multiple ways. For starters, I thought he processed his blocks and ran behind his blocks better than I've ever seen him in his career. And I think that has a lot to do with the offense they ran and the scheme and good coaching. But that coaching is coming back. So you can count on that being the case. And you could argue that with another year in that system, with that blocking scheme, with that coaching, he can process these blocks even better than he did this year. But he took a massive jump, I thought, with his mental processing. I also thought he took a massive jump when it came to getting vertical, getting downhill, taking the yards that are there, not dancing around, not trying to create too much outside, not trying to get lateral as often as he used to. And I think that was a coaching emphasis for sure, but he took to it well. So now you have a guy who's processing the blocks better when he needs to be patient behind the line of scrimmage, but also when he doesn't need to be patient, there aren't blocks to be processed. He's getting vertical and he's doing it fast, and he's getting downhill, and he's pretty much creating more yards than ever out of contact. So, or before contact. So I think on tape, and this doesn't even speak to, I think he was a much better pass protector this year as well. I would say he took a major jump there too. So now you have a guy who took a jump as a mental processor, who got vertical faster. I wouldn't say that's taking a jump. I think it's just a coaching point, but it's a good sign. And who's a much better pass protector than he's ever been in his career. So I think the first pro for re-signing Barkley is he was most of their offense for most of the season. And he was better on tape this year than he's ever been in his career, to me.
Big things that you mentioned was the processing, right? There's so much that goes into that. It's a very broad term, processing. What exactly does that mean, right? It's the vision to set up the blocks, understanding how to tempo yourself when you're running to allow those blocks to develop. I felt like his ability to diagnose holes on the backside of runs as well. It's like he had eyes in the peripheral parts of his head, right? And that's not something that we have always seen, because he has that one cut ability, that short area quickness. But we've also seen or saw plenty of plays, power gap plays, where he was kicking out, right? It was just power lead type plays where the play side guard in the center, depending on the defensive front and how the Giants blocked it up. There were two big guys blocking up front with the wide receivers blocking down, kind of like we were talking about earlier with that Sky Moore play. He was very good, in my opinion, allowing John Feliciano, who's not the most fleet of foot, to get out in front of him, and he would tempo himself to allow Feliciano to get to his block, or to allow Mark Lewinsky, who was climbing from the second level, to land his block. Remember that play against Tennessee? It didn't go for a touchdown, but it was a long play against the Tennessee Titans where Daniel Bellinger did an excellent job. I think we brought it up actually last podcast, where Daniel Bellinger did an excellent job getting the safety, and then Lewinsky came and got the other safety, and it was right at the time when Saquon Barkley was just accelerating and bursting through the holes. I felt like his mastering of using tempo and knowing when to explode and when to accelerate and when to cut was another part of his game that he has taken to another level, because that does involve mental. Yeah, it's a lot of athletic traits right there, but that's a lot of processing right there. Recognizing those backside cutback lanes, knowing when to hit them, kind of just feeling and anticipating the flow of those linebackers or those safeties who are scraping over the top, and then making them pay when they over pursue. So all of those traits, Saquon Barkley, he had those in 2018. Now I feel like he has them in spades, though, and he's definitely developed them, and we saw him on a more consistent basis, specifically maybe a little bit earlier on in the season, but still was definitely a point of his game that I took note of throughout the year. We talked about him on those All 22 podcasts, and I was like, man, from a mental standpoint, he's really kind of taking his game to another level.
I completely agree, and that's a great sign if they are going to re-sign him, because that could tell us that even if as he ages through this contract, or even just as soon as this year, the athleticism is down, it's not what it was, it's not the same, he can still be a really effective back because he's taken the processing to another level. And I agree that a lot of it was earlier in the season where we saw the best examples of this, but maybe the best example overall, at least, came, or for me, one of the best examples overall came at the very end of the season in that playoff game against the Vikings when they ran that his touchdown run to start the game. As that, we broke down at the time, he did a really good job in space there of pressing vertically for just a split second to get that defensive, I forgot who it was, I guess a linebacker in pursuit, to kind of settle down before then exploding back outside.
That's an excellent example of the exact play that I'm referring to, that Tennessee play, right? That Minnesota play was the same way because John Feliciano kicked out into space and he pressed vertical, right? I don't know if it was inside the numbers, but it was near the numbers, right?
Yeah.
And he kind of cuts down towards the numbers and he gets that safety. I think it was Cam Bynum, if I'm not mistaken, to go downward. And then all he did was cut outside. And now he had two blockers in between him and Bynum just removed from the play.
Yeah. And that was late in the year. So that's a good sign on that standpoint. I want to touch on the two other things and get your takes on that. The first one would be just, I don't know if you saw this, but I thought he did a much, I don't want to say better job, but made a more concerted effort to get vertical on some of these runs and not try to bounce outside. To me, that could be a coaching point, but at the same time, it's also a good sign moving forward because his athleticism is just it. No matter how we look at this thing, no matter how big of a fan you are of Saquon Barkley as a human being and a person, there's no way you can sit here and tell me his athleticism and his breakaway ability and his lateral agility are going to be the same next year and the year after that as they were when he was a rookie coming out of Penn State. That's just idiotic to say. It takes into account nothing, no logic whatsoever. And I don't think anyone would make that argument because it's illogical. So as you lose that athleticism and lateral agility, it's probably a better thing for you if you're getting vertical on these runs and you're running behind your awesome quads. As everybody loves the quad father, right? And how to pronounce that. I didn't know how to say that in any non-weird way, but like your strength, your ability, because he's a strong running back too. He's a 240-pound back that can run with power when he needs to. So I think that's a good sign as well. What are your thoughts on that? Did you notice that as well, that he was getting more vertical on some of the runs where in the past I'd kind of see him little dead to rights in the backfield and try to bounce outside?
Yeah, I think a lot of that has to do with the mental processing too. Just understanding that he can get vertical and get skinny through some holes that are pretty tight, holes that are pretty narrow. There was the Dallas touchdown run that I remember where Lewinsky kind of got blown off. He got blown off the line of scrimmage. He cuts back inside, presses the line of scrimmage, goes all the way into the line of scrimmage, and then he has two defenders who are right in front of his face, and he just jukes outside of them and then just accelerates for a touchdown. Now, he didn't run behind his pads there, but he acted as if he was because he can easily do that. And I think we saw, I'm trying to remember the game now, if it was Tennessee or what game it was early in the season, where we discussed it on the podcast and we were like, man, he is not afraid to get vertical, because that was a big talking point throughout the offseason was, he doesn't really run behind his pads. He does a little bit too much dancing, I think was the term. He took exception to that. If we remember, he went on a podcast and was like, I'm going to ball out this year. He cussed a couple times. We're like, oh, okay, Saquon Barkley. And then he did all of those things. But there were several plays throughout this season where he lowered his pads and he ran through people. And I really appreciate that because this guy's almost 240 pounds. He should be doing that, right?
Yes.
And I think last year we didn't see it. And maybe we didn't see it enough in 2018. But he out-athleted everybody at Penn State. He came into the NFL. They criticized him a little bit more than maybe I would have in terms of maybe he should run behind his pads more, because there were instances when he did. I remember like the Detroit game where he ran over two guys, and I think this was back in 2019, if I'm not mistaken. So 2019,
yes, I know the exact player.
That.
Yep.
Yeah. But in 2020, he suffers the injury. 2021, you didn't really see it. But 2022, this season, you started seeing that again. But I do feel like the dancing thing, we can put that to bed at this point, because you're right. He's running with a lot more conviction than we have ever seen before.
And again, I want to reiterate that is a very important thing if they decide to resign him, because that athleticism is not going to be the same as it always was. But having better processing and being a smarter running back. Look at Frank Gore. He's probably the best example of that, in my opinion. And they're not to me similar running backs at all from a style standpoint. But Frank Gore won with athleticism at Miami, and then he won with athleticism early in his career with the 49ers. And then as he aged, he became a different kind of running back and somebody who won with processing. And so you have to be that style, I think, to kind of stay in the NFL for a long time. If you're a type of back that relies on your athleticism, you're just never going to make it long term in the NFL.
No,
One
you'll have a
final,
role, and then it'll just be like a first rookie contract type of
right?
situation, and then you're done.
Yeah, because you can only rely on it for so long, especially if you get injuries, and we know he's had those. Okay, let's talk about one final thing before moving on to the next pro. Would be how much should I, or do you, or should we value his the jump that he made as a pass protector moving forward? Is that just something you can look at, Nick, and be like, I don't want to weigh that too heavily into the decision to re-sign him or not? Or is it something to look at like every great back needs to be able to do this now that he's become and first of all, where do you even view that right now versus the rest of the league, relative league? Do you think he's good at it, average, bad? So kind of address that.
I think he's great at it this season. I think he was, right? I mean, he's had issues with that his entire career. This year, we posted a bunch of clips onto our Twitter of Saquon Barkley diagnosing, identifying the blitz, and then getting over and executing the block. He didn't have too many whiffs this season. Like, no running back is going to bat 1,000 in that type of situation. It's a difficult spot to be put in. But I don't think defensive coordinators are going to be looking at the Giants in third down situations and be like, hey, Saquon Barkley is a liability now if he's out there. So let's scheme to specifically screw him up, right? I mean, a lot of defensive coordinators do that anyways to the running back, but I don't think he's the liability that we once thought he was as a pass protector. Now, in terms of valuing that in the contract, it's a positive, right? But Saquon Barkley, he offers a lot more than just, pass protection. That's not why you're resigning Saquon Barkley, obviously, but he definitely took it to another level this year. He took a lot of his game to another level this year, and that has to be weighed in to the fact that the Giants are discussing this contract extension, right? Because look how many times we've said, hey, he took this to another level. It's like the third or fourth time we're saying it, and I feel like it's all accurate. How much of that was the fact that he got injured in 2020, which stifled 2021? How much of that was the fact that he had an offensive coordinator who was stuck in 2010, that probably factored into it as well. But there were a lot of things that kind of held him back. But now we're getting to see, or at least we got to see in 2022, what he does have to offer. And it was pretty damn decent for a lot of the season.
Yeah, I mean, look, I thought I've said it before. I'll say it again. I might even said it on this podcast already, but this to me was his best season on film by far. I get it. 2018, he was the rookie of the year. I thought that year he relied a lot on his athleticism. This year he relied more on his processing. Next thing I want to talk about as far as pros go would be his impact on Daniel Jones's development, his impact on the offense in that regard. And in relation to that, grouping in another pro or whatever we would call it would be kind of that he's one of the not only the best playmaker they have from a skill position standpoint, maybe one of their only electric skill players they currently have on the roster. So how much do you want to talk? How much does that factor in your decision to potentially resign him? Because look, everyone could be like, oh, that doesn't matter. You let him walk, you keep the cap space, and you find another playmaker. Well, where are you going to find it, right? Look at this wide receiver free agent market. It's as disgusting as it could possibly get. I was looking at it today for fantasy standpoint. Dave Richard wrote an article on it. Darius Slayton's like his fifth best ranked receiver on the free agent market, dude. Like Jacoby Myers is like 2. Like, what are we talking about here? It is a disgustingly bad market. And so where do you find this guy? Say, okay, fine. There's no free agents. We don't want to pay the running back position. We don't have skill positions, electric players right now in the offense. We let Barkley walk. We don't sign any of the Jacoby Myers types. We just draft one. That doesn't necessarily always work out. Even if you go wide receiver at 25, Jordan Addison falls, something like that, or somebody you like, that doesn't mean they're going to be an immediate impact skill player. It doesn't mean they're going to be as impactful to Daniel Jones's development as Saquon Barkley was during the 2022 season, and as impactful to winning and losing games, which quite frankly, Saquon Barkley was for the first half of this 2022 season, really for the first 3 quarters of the 2022 season. Probably half, because after the bye week, he was kind of bad and the Giants were losing games. Let's just say the first half. So where does that factor in for you?
I think the offense, it didn't necessarily revolve around Saquon Barkley because the offense was so fluid throughout the year. There were portions, and I think you brought this up a little bit earlier, the whole entire game plan was about Saquon Barkley, specifically that first half of the season. Daniel Jones was a little bit more of a passenger, right? I don't like using that term game manager, but how many traditional pass sets did the Giants take in weeks like 2, 3, 4. 3 was a little bit different because they fell behind against Dallas, but week 4,
What
5,
they
it
throw
was
against the Bears? Like 11 attempts. What was their the pass attempts against the Bears was wild. That was one of the funniest like box scores to look at after the game.
it really was, and it was because the Bears were really playing Saquon Barkley. And that's why Daniel Jones had 2 touchdown runs off the play action bootleg. And the entire Giants passing attack was built off the play action. It was a lot of smoke and mirrors. But then it evolved into, hey, we're going to use more 11 personnel. We're going to transition away from 12 personnel because we have Isaiah Hodgins, and we're going to attack you with the quick passing game and also run the football effectively out of 11 personnel. Because, yeah, in that middle chunk of this season, around the bye week, just before the bye week, and then after the bye week, the Giants weren't really running the football that effectively outside of the Houston game when Saquon Barkley had 35 carries. And it was because they used a lot of 12 personnel. But once Hodgins was acclimated to the New York Giants, they started using 11 personnel, and you saw the EPA, the rushing EPA, go up for Saquon Barkley. So he still was a big part of the game plan. I also think if you look at those Minnesota games, again, I don't really know what the hell Ed Donatel was doing. If you go back and I went back, I think like a week or two ago and watched some of the Minnesota wild card win. And I was just like, what were they doing? Like there were so many times, Dan, where they had no idea what they were doing. But a lot of the times it
In a
was just
playoff game at home.
in a playoff game at home. Daniel Jones would just check it down to Saquon Barkley and pick up a couple of yards. So I still think that was a big point of emphasis from Mike Kafka because let's be honest here, Giants offensive skill positions, nobody was nearly as talented as Saquon Barkley. And if they bring him back, he will likely be the most talented guy in 2023 as well. So to your original question, which was how much of the game plan was he in 2023? I would say if there is a player not named Daniel Jones, the biggest contributor to the game plan would have to be Saquon Barkley. I don't even think it's even close because the wide receiver position, I mean, Darius Slayton didn't have a catch until like week 3, week 4, and he ended up being the number 1 receiver in the entirety of the year. It was just a door because of all the injuries and just the instability at wide receiver the Giants had.
I don't think I asked that question right because I do want to get your take on what I was trying to get at, and I just framed it poorly. So let me try to reframe this in a better way. What I was more so asking is, how important is the idea of re-signing a talent like Saquon Barkley with the consideration that if you don't re-sign him, you may not get an explosive skill player. Like, you can get this offseason you may not get one in relation to just how Daniel Jones develops, right? Because you're assuming like he's on this track, Jones. He has a second year of the same coaching. He started to take a massive leap, his biggest leap by far in 2022. We don't want to see him go back down. We want to see him go up or the same at worst. So how important is having that guarantee of a really explosive skill player for that Jones development?
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of utility in having that coming out of the backfield, somebody who can spring your rushing attack and be an effective weapon out of the backfield. Also somebody who is like best buddies with Daniel Jones, has a really great camaraderie with Daniel Jones. But you're right. If the Giants don't get a guy at 25, are they going to really find like a true dynamic, explosive weapon at wide receiver? I don't know. They could find maybe like a Tank Dell guy type of guy, but is that a true number 1? It's just hard.
Are we
to
just
say.
recycling a Wan'Dale type, right? Yeah,
exactly. But I mean, as we get into the cons, we'll probably discuss the flip side of that argument. And I do feel like there is merit to that argument as well. And I don't want to vacillate between both yes and no in terms of Saquon Barkley. But absolutely having a player like Saquon Barkley, who I'm sure most of the NFL would say is one of the more dynamic backs in the NFL, helps Daniel Jones, helps the explosive playmaking ability of this offense, which, as we'll bring up a little bit later, this offense really sucked in terms of creating explosive plays, dead last in the league.
Right. And then we'll get into that for sure. And for me, just to answer that, my own question in a briefer, and I guess like just how I would kind of view it would be, are you willing to take, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, are you willing to take a short-term maybe deal with a player like Barkley with the mindset of, well, I don't want Jones to take a step back. So maybe if this hurts us a bit long-term because we're signing a running back and it's bad business, it'll help us now because it helps Jones.
But the team, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I definitely think the decision on Daniel Jones does factor into this because you don't know the running back that you're going to find. But I don't think that is the primary decision. I think that's definitely a secondary or a tertiary type of choice.
And that's fair too. And I think even though it's a pro, it should be viewed, like you said, as a tertiary choice. Okay, how about another pro I find that I'm curious to get your take on, which would be Barkley's still an asset, right? If they re-sign Saquon Barkley, there's not going to be a number they re-sign him to that makes him unattractive, in my mind at least, because they've already kind of said, he said, I'm not going to reset the market. They've said that's okay. we want you at this number. He has a number that's higher. It'll come to some agreement in between. But if he does sign for that number, let's say 13, 14, whatever it is, he's still an asset. And so you can still trade him if things go wrong. Say this next season goes bad. The schedule is tougher. They get injuries. Something happens. And they're not in the playoff hunt by the time the trade deadline comes around, or they're starting to trend in a bad direction. We know Dave Gettleman would never do it, right? He wasn't going to trade anyone before a trade deadline. He did, or he had the opportunity to, and he didn't. Instead, he actually traded for someone in Leonard Williams, impending free agent. One of the wildest moves I've still ever seen by a GM, just from an overall, 30,000-foot view standpoint. I've never seen a GM do that before. Your team's out of it. They're not in the playoff hunt, and you're a buyer at the trade deadline. That was just wild to see in action. It did happen, but I don't think Joe Shane's going to follow that route. If the Giants are falling apart, he's going to be a seller. So you can still sell him for assets. The Panthers just traded Christian McCaffrey for a nice slew of picks. So what is that? How much does you value that? The idea that, look, it's still an asset. So why do I want to give him up rather than sign him when all I lose is cap space if I sign him? But if I do let him walk, I'm now giving up the opportunity to potentially trade him down the line.
I mean, yeah, you would get the compensatory pick if you do let him walk, which I don't know the number on that, but I'm imagining it would probably be a third round pick. So you would get something to allow him to leave,
but only if they don't make a big free agency.
But only if exactly.
Yeah.
So that there is a little bit. Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's definitely value in thinking in that way. I don't know if you want Joe Shane to go into this thinking, oh, this is going to fail, so we're probably going to trade him, but you want to have that contingency plan. So a no trade clause was definitely be something that I would not advise, and I'm sure that Joe Shane in the front office is well aware of that.
Yeah, you can see the Raiders are really regretting giving Derek Carr that no trade clause. That's screwing them over right now big time. Yeah, definitely not a no trade clause. I just view it as like he still is an asset. When you let sets walk versus when you bring them back, just like the Giants have pretty much done with a lot of their players they've drafted that did not sign to second contracts or re-signed to second contracts, you're kind of losing out on some of the value of that asset in some ways. And just to clear up what we were talking about, Nick and I, because we haven't never really gone in depth about this, and I know a lot of people don't know how it works. The compensatory pick that Nick was referencing, if you lose a big free agent, you can get back what they call a compensatory draft pick, which actually the Giants traded for one this year with Gary Stoney. These picks happen at the very end of the round, either the third, fourth, fifth. I think they go through the fifth round, maybe the sixth. And you get one back if you lose a big free agent, but only if you don't sign another free agent from another team to a massive deal or a comparable deal. There's some formula for it. I don't know it. No one knows it inside out, but there's a formula for it. So while they could get back a pick for Saquon Barkley, a third round pick, if they let him walk, it would require them not making a splash at, say, linebacker or corner or wide receiver, or any of these positions they might consider making a splash at in free agency. Now, I think if they do let Barkley walk, ultimately, Nick, they will get back that comp pick for him, because I don't think they're going to be big players in free agency. That's my prediction for this free agency. I think it'll be another kind of Glowinski and then back end type, because they still need to resign so many of their own and use all that cap space for Jones and for, Andrew Thomas down the line and all those players, Dex McKinney, but even Julian Love maybe this offseason as well. So I don't think they're going to be big players in free agency, but that's what we mean by the comp pick formula. Let's get to another pro for Saquon Barkley. And for me, I think how relatively cheap running back contracts are to wide receiver is somewhat of a pro for re-signing. For example, Nick, I'm giving you a scenario right now. You can draft a running back on day 2 or 3, and he's now your running back, and you can add some others. You have Brightwell in the mix, and you have another one, let's say. And you could have Jacoby Myers on your team. Or you could draft a wide receiver or find your Nets Hodgins or find your Nets Richie James and have Barkley on your team. To me, I'm going with the Barkley Hodgins or the Barkley Richie James over the Jacoby Myers and rookie running back every time. And I think the Jacoby Myers route actually might cost more money.
Yeah, you got to look at the wide receiver market. It's incredible right now. At their last offseason with Devontae Adams and Tyreek Hill, it's skyrocketed. The running back market, the most anybody makes is $16 million at Christian McCaffrey. So you can get a rookie wide receiver on that rookie deal. That's very valuable, especially if he's a first round pick and you have control of that 5th-year option. So I'm right there with you.
Yeah, and it's even not even just like the rookie guy on the rookie contract that breaks out or wide receiver, even just like the Hodgins of the world, right? You're getting pretty good production out of Hodgins for not much money, and you didn't have to use any major assets to get him. I'm not so sure like that. Like, to me, the Giants are a much tougher team to defend with Hodgins and Barkley versus like Myers and I don't know. I'm thinking of a back guy like Roshan Johnson from Texas right now, right? Like that's a tougher team to defend right now. I feel like with Barkley on there now, that doesn't factor in Barkley's longevity, the offensive line, things that definitely impact Barkley's ability to be a good asset long term. But at least for the short term, I feel like as we continue to see this big trend of wide receiver contracts breaking the bank, I saw something today that the suggestion is Justin Jefferson's new contract is going to be $33 million per year. And like you said, Barkley will probably top out at $14 million per year. We're talking about almost a $20 million per year cap difference there. So as those continue to like move in that direction of the wide receivers this way and the running backs kind of stagnating or even in some degree going this way, you can start to see more value potentially for spending at running back.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
that's the argument to it, especially when, as you said, and I know not a lot of teams have this, but so much of your offense is centralized around that player, especially
Right.
in the first half of the season. So
Yep.
much of it. This team is completely different without Saquon Barkley. And I don't know if they're a playoff team this year without Saquon Barkley.
Right. And that's a big factor as well. So let's talk about another pro, and that is his leadership, both on the field, as you've seen in some of the Giants videos they post to their social media and to their YouTube, and then in the locker room as well. Where do you value the leadership factor when it comes to re-signing Saquon Barkley?
It definitely needs to be factored in. It says something. It doesn't tell the whole story because there are so many variables that go into it. But it says something if Saquon Barkley does everything right, has this career year, and then you let him walk. It says something to the locker room. And I think we saw that in previous regimes with players like Dalvin Tomlinson. Now, at the end of the day, it's all a business. Saquon Barkley gets, a $16-17 million a year. And I think everybody understands that. But I think the Giants know that there is certainly a value in bringing this guy back who was a team captain, who players gravitate around, who has done everything correct, who has said all the right things. He wants to be a New York Giant. He has made that clear. And I do believe that there is definitely a ton of respect around the locker room for him. So, yeah, bringing him back, there's a lot of utility in that.
And I was kind of grouping those separately, but we can combine those two, which is leadership factor on the field. Because I was thinking, like, if the Giants lose this leader from their team, is it going to make a big difference in the wins and losses? Just in the sense that, like, he's one of their best leaders. He's one of their most important leaders, both on and off the field. Do you have someone to kind of replace him?
He's a great locker room presence, but I don't necessarily think that not having him on the field, it's going to affect your product because he's a good football player. But it's not like the team's just going to crumble because his leadership isn't there. Yeah. But when there is adversity, you know that he is there to kind of keep things together. He acts as an adhesive, a glue to keep things together. Even when during those dog days of the Joe Judge era, he was there saying all the right things. He wasn't, throwing anybody under the bus or anything like that, even though he probably could have. So I think that is important for sure. But at the same time, whoever is the running back next year, I'm sure the team will kind of gravitate around. It's just when shit hits the fan, is that running back going to act or lead as well as Saquon Barkley? I'm not really certain that that's the case, depending on who it is, obviously.
Right. And that kind of leads right into the second thing is what does it tell your locker room if you don't re-sign him? Same could be said about Daniel Jones, right? What does it tell your locker room if you're really not re-signing these guys after they take you to the playoffs? And that's what you're telling them is we don't believe in them long-term and we would rather restart here. Now I tend to gravitate, Nick, toward these guys understand for the most part, or at least the ones that matter, not the younger guys, the older guys, understand that this is a business. And business decisions happen. And, they may not feel like you could ever possibly consider letting a guy like Saquon Barkley walk. Like, right. Like I tweeted something about Barkley a month ago and Darius Slayton lost his mind about it. And he's just like, how could you ever consider this? Because these guys probably aren't considering the factors like age and injury history and, the salary cap and things of that nature. But obviously it's a business and they understand that part of it because they've been a part of this business as well. So I tend to think that what does it tell your locker room? I think if they could get over it fast if, let's say, the offensive line made a massive jump and whoever's running behind that offensive line is productive as well. Or the offense made a complete transition. Now we're a pass-first offense and we're throwing for a ton of yards and the front running back doesn't matter as much, kind of like that Vikings game where they ran only 9 times with Barkley and they still had their best offensive game in the playoffs, like those types of things. I think you get over it fast if you're the players.
Winning cures everything. It's that simple. If you win football games, it's going to cure everything. If you start losing, if you face some adversity, that's when it could rear its ugly head.
Yeah, you don't build a culture by having guys run laps after practice. You build a culture by winning football games. And you build a culture by winning meaningful football games, not
Yeah.
the back end of that Judge 2020 season when they're beating up on bad teams with like backup quarterbacks. So we've learned that through the time. But let's get into the cons now. It's time to break down the cons of resigning Saquon Barkley. And yeah, you have that reaction, Nick, because as you can see, just looking at the document, there's a much longer list of cons than pros when it comes to resigning this player, unfortunately. Let's start with the first con. And the first con for me would be age. We know this is the first con because it also bleeds into history, the historical decision making when it comes to re-signing the running back position. So we now have greater studies that show about at the age of 26 and a half, running back production almost falls completely off a cliff, or no, starts to fall off a cliff. Then at age 27, running back production almost completely falls off the cliff around the NFL. Some of the sports doctors have done a good job of explaining why when it comes to just the body and the injury factor of it all. So what we're doing here with the Giants is signing a player at 26 years old, just before the point of time where historically these players would completely fall off a cliff from a reduction standpoint at this specific position. Obviously, other positions you can play much longer into your lifespan, but running back is not one of those positions. So what the Giants are doing is signing a player at the age where he's about to fall off historically. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to happen to Barkley. Like I said earlier, Tiki Barber played for a lot of years. Frank Gore played for a lot of years into his older years. You're also then fighting history too, because almost all of the running back second contracts started to become an issue around this time, 26, 27 years old. Now someone will say, well, what about Derrick Henry? Everybody looks for the one example of where it worked out with Derrick Henry. But then you turn the page and you say, wait a second, didn't Derrick Henry have a fully injured season this past year in 2022 where he was just injured the entire time and the offense completely collapsed without having him? I know he came back at the end, but he wasn't himself. And even if he did, he missed a lot of time with injuries. So even in the best example of it working out, it kind of didn't work out. And not only did it not work out, you look at it now and you're like, do we really want this Derrick Henry contract before the Titans right now? Like, is this even a good thing to have him back? And then you think of the most extreme example, which is Ezekiel Elliott, who's now slated to account for $16.72 million against the cap for the Dallas Cowboys in 2023, and only $4.86 million of that would be cap savings if they cut him. They'd take a $11.86 million dead cap hit, and they're planning to do it anyway. They're most likely going to cut him anyway, just to save that $5 million in cap space. That's how little they value having him on the roster. They feel like they're better off with the $5 million in cap space. Now they might restructure it, but I'm hearing they might cut him. What does that say about their feelings on that contract that they signed? So let's start there, Nick. What are your thoughts on the idea of signing a running back to a second deal at age 26?
The Derrick Henry one he was injured. He broke his foot. That was last season. He played, I think, the majority of the year
But
this
he
year.
got injured this season, didn't he?
I mean, he might have been dinged up here and there, but he played most of the year. But
I thought he was playing through the injury when he came back, but I might be wrong. I thought he missed it.
yeah, last year he broke his foot, but it's regardless because I understand exactly what you're saying. And you brought up Ezekiel Elliott. I mean, Todd Gurley signed a contract and never played on that new deal. They had to get rid of him. And he was somebody who had an extensive injury history dating back to his time at Georgia. Look, man, Saquon Barkley, I love Saquon Barkley, but you have high ankle sprain in 2019 that you came back from and everything was good. You tore your ACL in week 2 of 2020, and then you had just a lot of stupid injuries in 2021. That's probably the best way to describe it. He's 26 years old. He has developed the mental aspects of running the football, the nuances. I feel like he has grown a lot in 2022. But dude, at the end of the day, that athletic ability is going to start to wane. Do you really want to give that type of contract 15, 16 million per year to the running back? I feel like it's a fair debate. And I go back and forth at the 12 and a half, 13 type number, and I'll probably reserve my final judgment until the end of the podcast, but it's a young man's position, the running back.
Well, I was going to say this, as far as the first point, which is the age factor and kind of bucking the trend of history, trying to become the outlier that, can play past 26, 27 at the same level that they played at 22, 23. That for me is an argument for a fully healthy back, right? Like I even think, because that doesn't factor in just the players who were injured at some point in their career with major injuries, like Barkley had a surgery. That's every running back. So even if they're fully healthy, I think there's a massive risk to paying somebody past the age of 26. But now we bleed into the second con, which is unrelated, but also factors in the same, which you already touched on, which is injury history. Because not only are you now paying a running back who's 26 years old, which is a risk regardless, you're also paying a running back at 26 who's had an injury history. Here's Barkley's injury history. In 2016, he had a right ankle sprain against Michigan State at Penn State. He missed, or played the week after. Then he missed 2 games as a freshman with an ankle injury. In 2018 was his first NFL injury. He had just like a hamstring pull, grade 1, nothing crazy. In 2019, high ankle sprain, grade 2. And then so just so far, just some ankle issues, a little bit of hamstring issues there, but mostly ankle issues. Then, and that was against the Bucs in 2019. In 2020, that's his first major injury. He suffers a torn ACL in week 2 against the Bears. Biggest issue with this injury for me, Nick, was he also suffered the torn MCL at the same time as the ACL. Now, there's a difference these days in ACL tears. Some people, and you could look at the sports doctors who discuss this. There's clean ACL tears, like the one Wan'Dale Robinson suffered, and he might be back for training camp, they're saying, which is crazy because he got injured in second half of the season. And then there's the not clean ACL tears, the MCL and the ACL tears, or the meniscus ACL and MCL. When you get the multiple tears of that knee. And Barkley, from what I've heard, his tear had so much swelling and his injury had so much swelling that he had to actually wait a little bit of time to have that surgery. Now, some people have said that's typical for all surgeries, but I'm not so sure. I don't know that if that's true or not true. So I'm not a doctor, obviously, but I do know that there are differences in the ACL tears. The ones that are also MCL tears are definitely more of a factor. Then in 2021, of course, he got that unlucky low ankle injury against the Cowboys. But remember, this is now the 4th time we've heard ankle injury in his history. And then this year, obviously, he had the neck stinger and a little bit of that shoulder injury, which he played through pretty much this whole season. So that's also the second con for me, which would be that this is not only you're not only signing a second running back at 26 to a contract, you're also signing someone who has an injury history.
Yeah, the injury history is a big part about it. It's a gigantic factor. I think that's something that you must include because, like you said, there's a long history of a lot of running backs just falling off of a cliff at 26, 27. A lot of those running backs, they weren't as talented as Saquon Barkley, but they probably also didn't have the extensive injury history that Saquon Barkley has at this point in his career.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something we should factor in as well. Let's get to the next con for signing Saquon Barkley, and that would be supply and demand. You're Joe Shane, you're the general manager, and you're looking at this thing from a 30,000-foot view, and you're saying to yourself, well, this is the most loaded free agent running back class I've ever seen, maybe, or not ever, but I've seen in a while, right? We've got Josh Jacobs, we've got Kareem Hunt, we've got Saquon Barkley. More importantly than that, because who wants to go to free agency to sign a running back? We don't want to not sign Barkley and then give cap space to a Josh Jacobs. Someone was suggesting to me, don't re-sign Barkley. Let's re-sign Singletary. If the Giants don't re-sign Barkley, don't you dare talk to me about free agent running backs. I don't want any of them. Unless they're coming on the Breida contract, don't talk to me. I don't even want another. Who's the dude? The Booker, which they had to take dead cap on. Remember? Booker was like, oh, well, Gettleman got one right. He was kind of right on Booker. Then we're cutting him the next offseason and taking dead cap on that deal. So don't even talk to me about signing a running back if it's not going to be Barkley. But the supply and demand also comes in. This is a stacked draft class. I've now seen 2 of my favorite draft analysts, Dane Brugler and Daniel Jeremiah, tweet recently and within 2 days apart about how much they love this running back draft class. They're saying that you can find starters deep into day 2. He's saying you can find starters on day 3. And as I've looked at this class briefly, Nick, I love some of these day 2, day 3 backs, my man. Like last year, we were in love with Dameon Pierce. He was like a top 5 back, though, overall for me, I think, on our final rankings. I think he came in at 3. And that's like somebody who in this class, Dameon Pierce, dude, he would probably not even make my top 10 in this class. It's so deep. Like I take Rashawn Johnson over him, and he's back end of my top 10, if even making my top 10. There's dudes in that 7 running back 6 to 12 range in this draft class that are going to be starters somewhere in the NFL if they get the right opportunity. They have the talent to do it. So now you look at the supply and demand of the situation. You say to yourself, well, I can re-sign Barkley, but if I don't, I have a really good opportunity to find a really good back for much cheaper right away in this draft class.
Yeah, and that's what we've kind of been talking about for years now on the Big Blue Banter podcast is investing early day 3, late day 2 picks into the running back position to find a guy who's going to be on a cheap deal for 4 years. And we've seen running backs slide in the draft recently. We've seen Jonathan Taylor go on day 2, Kenneth Walker, Brees Hall, a lot of very talented guys who could possibly be top 5 backs in the next couple
True.
years type of profiles, right? So I haven't studied this class extensively. I've heard a lot of names that interest me, and I'm excited to get into their film. But I have heard very reputable draft analysts similar to you say that this is a very deep running back class, and that must be factored in. Especially, you didn't even bring up some of the names in terms of those free agents, like the Tony Pollards of the world. Like
Yes.
he's going to have a market as well. There's Jamal Williams, who is a different type of runner. There's a lot of guys who are free agents this year. It's a saturated market.
And I guess that would be more of a con toward the idea of re-signing him before letting him hit the market, right? Because if you look at it like that and you're thinking about all these guys on the market, first of all, not only are those guys on the market, Tony Pollard, Josh Jacobs, etc., but also every NFL GM is well aware of what we just discussed with how strong this running back class is in the draft. So they already have their own plans for addressing the position after free agency. So if you let Barkley hit the market instead of re-signing him before hitting the market, he may come back to you and sign with your original terms, your $12 million, instead of finding a middle ground here and compromising with Saquon and being like, all right, we don't even want to let you hit the market. Let's just get it done. 14, 15 mil. Sure. Everyone's happy. You let him hit the market. Everyone else is adjusting to the supply factor being as high as it's ever been and the demand being so low. He comes back to you and he says, I'll take the 12. I'll take the 12 and a half.
12 and a half is a solid number for Saquon Barkley right now, but we have to wait and see how that plays out because all it takes is one freaking team to be like, yo, I'll reset the market for you.
Right, exactly. Okay, let's talk about another potential con for Saquon Barkley. This is a very big one for me. And this would be, I'll group all this together, but it's a few different points. One, Saquon Barkley had a much better first half than the second half. In the second half of the year, he had just 713 yards from scrimmage over his last 9 games. That's less than 80 yards per game, which would be around league average. 1, 2, a lot of those games, if you look at the advanced stats from like Doug Analytics, who posted them, his rushing yards over expected was above ground first half of the year. Second half of the year, below ground for the majority of the year. 3, the Giants had their best offensive game by far of the year when Barkley only had 9 rushing attempts against the Vikings in the wild card round. So, with all that said, I think that Saquon Barkley is no longer, or at least by the time it matters, I should say, Nick, okay? So this take them about to have, let me make this clear for the listeners so I don't get buried for this take. And I know you'll understand, Nick, but others might not. By the time it matters in the playoffs, I'm not so sure Saquon Barkley can be the same player that he was in 2018 or in the first half of this season. Why do I say that? Well, in 2018, Saquon Barkley had 9 individual runs that were at least 40 yards. He became one of 3 running backs to do that in the last 30 years, and he nearly broke Chris Johnson's 10 in 2009. That's when he won Offensive Player of the Year, Chris Johnson. This year, he had just one of those runs, and it came in week 1 of this season.
Yep.
So, is Barkley the same player? I put up a clip of his run against the Eagles in the divisional round. Now, I can only hope he's dealing with an injury that he didn't report for that game. Because if you look at that run he had against the Eagles for 36 yards, that breakaway speed wasn't anywhere close to the breakaway speed he put on tape in 2018. You're looking at 2 different players. And then if you take it back to the Rose Bowl game, Penn State against USC, the run he had against USC, that 80-yard run, was the most impressive run I've ever seen by a running back in my entire life. And similar to the Jacksonville run in his first game of his rookie season, the Giants against the Jaguars, I think it was week 1 or week 2. That was also one of the most impressive runs I've ever seen in an NFL running back. Well, first was college, then it was NFL. I haven't seen a run like that since. And I didn't see a run like that in the 2020 season at all. I don't think the acceleration is the same as it used to be with Saquon Barkley. And if it's not what it was now in 2022, it's not going to get better. This is not something that gets better with age. This is something that gets worse with age.
It is something that declines. And I'll say this, though, speaking for Saquon Barkley, he was still erasing angles, right, from safety. Like the one run that was over 40 yards was a 60, I think 6 or 68-yard run against Tennessee. He just
68.
absolutely erased Amani Hooker's angle towards the sideline. And we've seen those on like 16-yard runs and 20-yard runs and 25-yard runs. But that pure breakaway speed that made Saquon Barkley, I think it's fair to at least question it. Now, the advanced numbers on it don't necessarily paint that same picture because he reached 21.9 miles per hour in 2018. This year, he reached 21.3. There's not that big of a drop off. On that run that you were referencing, I believe it was 19.8 miles per hour. I think that was more maybe of just a good recovery from that safety who realized I can't take this shallow angle because I'm screwed. Because if you remember, that safety kind of stepped towards the line of scrimmage, was like, no, screw that. And he kind of circled around and then cut the angle off to catch Saquon Barkley. I feel like that was just a good individual play from that safety. But like you said, man, even if the speed is still the same, how much longer is that going to last? That is a depreciating type of skill set and trait that he currently possesses. And we're questioning it now. Next year, the year after, once he's 2 or 3 years into a contract, the Giants do resign him. There's no way that speed is just going to improve. And that is just a freaking fact right there.
Yeah, that's physics right there. And I think even on that run, I agree the safety took a good angle, but there was a point of that run where he does plant and try to get vertical. And that's the part where I've seen him do it even with that angle the safety takes, and he's just gone because he just has that to his game. That one topped out at 19.8, which isn't great. And I felt like on that run, when he did try to really hammer that acceleration, it just wasn't the same. And it could have been injury, but it also could have just been wear and freaking tear. The Giants played him 74% of snaps. They played him more than almost any running back in the NFL. And now you're getting to the playoffs. How could that ever work out? Like, are we ever going to see a season where Barkley is at his best for the playoff run? No. What running back is at his best for the playoff run? I don't know how that's what running back that gets, almost every single snap on the offense side of the ball is going to get better as the season wears on. That just doesn't make sense, right? Like, it doesn't add up physically. They're taking hits. They're getting injuries that they don't talk about. So it's a tough sell for me that I can think he's going to get better from the athleticism department, which also brings me to my next thing that we haven't actually discussed. I didn't put in the doc, but you brought it up earlier and I wanted to talk to you about. I think earlier in his career, you brought up the Lions game. He was now, again, let me preface this by saying he's gotten a lot better at processing. He's gotten a lot better at getting vertical on runs behind the line of scrimmage that are dead to rights that he used to try to get lateral on. But in space, and I know the numbers back this up if you look at PFF, Barkley is not the same back he used to be when it comes to creating yards after contact. I feel like he used to be a more physical, a violent tackle breaker in open space than he is now. That's an eye test thing, Nick. What are your thoughts on? So and I know the yards after contact does back that up to some degree, but those can be tricky. Eye test wise, do you still think he's the same tackle breaker and yards after contact guy in space that he was in those games like you referenced, like versus the Lions?
Yeah, it's pretty substantial too. If you look at PFF's numbers,
Yeah,
like he was 3.23 yards after contact. He's 2.75 this year. I still think there are plays, and I'm trying to kind of remember some of the plays where he's running through arm tackles and things like that.
3.23. That was 2018, Nick.
That was 2019.
What was the 2018 yards?
2018 was 3.34.
So he had back-to-back years of really good yards after contact, and now this year it's a much bigger drop, almost a half a yard difference.
Yeah, and I think Saquon Barkley, in terms of is he still a physical back? I think he can be, yes, but there aren't a lot of, and I don't have the plays in front of me, but there aren't a lot of plays that are coming to my mind where he was just, it's like, I had just embarrassed you with my physicality, which is something that we did see in 2018 and in 2019. So yeah, I think you can say there's some concern there. I still think he's capable of doing so. Maybe he was just a little bit more precise as a runner because he developed better in terms of his processing. So he didn't necessarily have to take on that contact. But yeah, I mean, the numbers back it up, like you said. And I'm trying to kind of think through my mind right now and be like, is there a play that really jumps out at me from 2022 where it was like, yeah, he just ran over a linebacker? Because defensive backs, yeah, whatever. Safeties, I'll be like, okay, that's good. But like a cornerback, that's not that big of a deal to me. But a linebacker, I don't necessarily remember one from 2022 that really jumps out at you.
Yeah, and I feel like that's been and look, that's just maybe he's made that decision personally that he doesn't want to try to get through those tackles because he wants to have a longer career in the NFL, and that's fine if he's made that. You can do whatever you want to prolong your career. You should think about yourself first, but it doesn't help the Giants, in my opinion, if you're not the same yards after contact back that you were in 2018 and 2019.
But I'll say this, man, he's still someone who falls through contact. It's not like people hit him.
He falls through contact. I'm just talking about the break and the after contact. Gotcha. He's definitely falling through contact for sure. He's not going to, he's 245. He better fall through contact, right? Yeah. But let's talk about the next con, I think, and this is a massive one, and it's salary cap allocation. It's the idea of allocating $13, $14, $15 million a year of your cap space to this position of running back. When we've seen now, everybody puts this graphic out every Super Bowl, but now it's like 15 or 16 straight years where a Super Bowl winner has allocated like 1.2 million to the leading rusher. Nothing, essentially. I mean, you go back, there's like James Starks, names like James Starks on the list. I mean, that's how old we're Super Bowl we're talking about, right? Like James Starks has been in the NFL in a long time, right?
Yeah.
And so now you're allocating, you have a salary cap every year. You don't have unlimited money in the NFL. This isn't the MLB. This isn't the NBA. There's no soft cap. There's no luxury cap. This is a hard salary cap league. Now, it can be manipulated, obviously. It's a fluid number that you can dip into future years to make your current year number bigger or smaller. All those things are true. But the idea of being the team that kind of bucks this trend, wins a Super Bowl, wins a championship, competes for championships while paying the running back a lot of money. Once again, it puts you in this bucket that we've already discussed in plenty of these cons of you now have to be the outlier, right? You have to be the team that bucks the trend rather than the team that, falls in line with what's working.
Sure, Dan. I think you can, but is it the most prudent thing to do? I'm not really sure, especially when you're paying your quarterback $35 million. Like the Giants aren't going to have that luxury, and it sucks. But if they do re-sign Daniel Jones, you're not going to have that luxury, Dan, of having a rookie on a rookie contract. It's that simple, man. That is such a huge part of team construction. Now you're allocating 30, 35 million or whatever it is to the quarterback position, and you're going to give like 16 or 15 to the running back position. It makes things very difficult, especially, and I know I've said this so many times that I feel like I should just shut up, but you're going to more than likely reset the market with Andrew Thomas and Dexter Lawrence. So who the hell else are you going to pay if you just have those four on your roster over the next couple seasons? And then Xavier McKinney. And if you draft anyone good and you're going to have to re-sign them in the future, you get the benefit of the rookie deal. But it sucks that Daniel Jones' rookie contract was absolutely wasted with incompetent football. But now if you are going to re-sign him, you really got to be judicious with how you allocate your funds, and giving a running back $15 million a year is not necessarily the most prudent thing to do.
Yeah. And so we'll wrap up there and we'll get to our final conclusions. But one final thing I want to say, to the argument that people have made, which is the Giants were nothing without Saquon Barkley this year. How could you possibly give away the one player who made the entire offense? Well, I would say to you, is this what you really want? Right? Like, is this what we really want? Do we want the Giants offense to be what it was this year? No, of course not. That Giants offense was bad for most of the season. They were dead last in explosive plays, and they didn't score many points until the very end of the year. You want the offense to be one of the ones you just saw in the Super Bowl, pass first, explosive. One of the ones you've seen in the past 2 years, the final 4 teams in the conference championship rounds. Those are explosive pass first offense. So don't think too much about what they were this year and losing out on that. Think about how to achieve what the optimal goal is, a pass first offense. So I'll just close it with that. So now, final conclusion, Nick, you got to make an answer. What would you want to do with the Saquon Barkley situation? Would you want to re-sign him? Would you want to let him go? And if you choose to re-sign him, what is the price point you want to re-sign him at?
But first, let me preface this, Dan. I don't think I'm going to be drastically upset any direction the Giants go in. If they decide to re-sign him, I can understand that. If they decide to let him go, I can completely understand that. I think a 12.5, 13, I think I'm okay with that. Optimally, though, I think he's going to be.
We want your optimal decision, Nick. No one wants to know what you're okay with. No, I'm kidding. I understand what you're trying to do. You're trying to.
He might have a 20. He might have a good 2023 season, right? 2024, he might be okay, but it's going to be a depreciating asset. So if they do decide to re-sign him, I want it to be a short-term deal at around that 12.5, 13 number. And that's where I think Joe Shane is at. So if we're saying it's at 12.5 million, Dan.
Or you can pick the number. How about that? Just what would you want? Yeah.
And I would want it to be lower, more so. But if it is at 12.5 million, I think I'm okay with it happening. But if I had to decide right now, I think I'm going to say no.
Okay. So you wouldn't want to, and that's probably the lowest it'll go anyway. So you would decide not to re-sign Saquon Barkley.
Yeah. Unless it was like, I'm okay with the franchise tag. I just know he's not going to be. He's going to want some a little bit of longevity. Like I said throughout the podcast, I like Saquon Barkley. It's difficult for me to say no, but if you're putting me on the spot, I think with the deep running back class, with the benefits of the rookie contract for those running backs, with Daniel Jones getting paid 30 plus million, with the fact that he has an injury history, all those cons that we went through, I think are very valid, even though some of those pros are as well. So I would lean no.
Yeah. And I think that's totally fair. My final take on this will be best case scenario for me would be Joe Shane works absolute magic and is able to franchise tag and trade Saquon Barkley for assets, even if that's just a 4th round pick or a 3rd round pick. That to me is the best case scenario. The second best case scenario for me would be that Joe Shane convinces Saquon Barkley to play a season on the franchise tag, and the Giants can get Barkley for this next season on the franchise tag and then revisit this next year where we're at. In which case I will lead to my third best scenario, because I don't think scenarios 1 or 2 are actually in play. But if somehow magically he does the tag and trade, I'll be super pumped. But because I don't think scenarios 1 or 2 are in play, the third scenario for me is I would not re-sign Barkley for any price. So for me, this has nothing to do with Saquon Barkley. For me, this has to do with insert any running back here. There is no running back in the NFL I would sign to a second contract. My strategy for this is very simple. It's blunt, and I believe it's tried and true. You just recycle these rookie deals. You can take more than you at once if you want to, but you keep making sure that you're only allocating as minimally as possible to this position, because this position doesn't age well. This position gets injured a lot, and this position is reliant on the offensive line. Now, with that money I'm saving by never giving a running back a second contract, I'm upgrading my offensive line. The only scenario where I would consider re-signing a running back to the second contract is a scenario that's not possible for the Giants, and that's if you have a quarterback on a rookie contract. The Giants do not have a quarterback on a rookie contract. They have a quarterback who's about to make a lot of money against the cap. So there, under no scenario would I be interested really in re-signing any running back to a second contract while paying a quarterback, because I believe that will impact your ability to improve your offensive line. And without your offensive line, to me, your running back is worth next to nothing, especially as you move long term and he ages out and he gets more injuries and he gets older. So unfortunately for me, I do not want the Giants to re-sign Saquon Barkley. I think the Giants will re-sign Saquon Barkley. So I've resigned myself to that fact. But if it were up to me and I was playing the role of general manager, I would make a decision that would piss off the locker room. It would piss off the teammates, players like Slayton, who can't even comprehend the idea of not re-signing a player like this. And I'd see if I can make it work moving forward as a GM with my players and with the core we have being Daniel Jones and then whatever else you have, the Andrew Thomas, the Dexter Lawrence, without Saquon Barkley, or insert any running back here for me.
Yeah, I think that's a fair take too, Dan. And it's tough, man. It's a
It's
business,
tough.
though. It's a business, and I think the major point about it, and there are a lot of cons there. The major point is the fact that that quarterback isn't on the rookie deal anymore, right?
Yes.
The quarterback was on the rookie deal. I am much more open to entertaining it. I'm still open to entertaining it, but if I had to be decisive, yeah, I'm on the no side as well.
Okay, that's what we have. The definitive case for and against Saquon Barkley, re-signing him. We will likely be doing one of these, though. It may not come for Nick is going away tomorrow, so it's definitely not coming until next week at the earliest. But I think we're both going to want to kind of break this one down with a lot more film and a lot more kind of research before we do it. But we're going to do this one for Daniel Jones as well. So that'll be an interesting one. We're going to try to, at least. So be on the lookout for that. Otherwise, have a great rest of your week, and we'll talk to you soon.